Hey guys, today we're going to begin our review for the AP European History exam. I'd like to first discuss the way this exam review will be organized. It will be based upon the course and exam description shown on this page. You can also find this course and exam description at apcentral.collegeboard.com, and I would advise you to go through this with a highlighter and your notes marking things that you think will be important. I will focus this exam on information and content that we have studied in class as well. And what you'll notice on the concept outline, as shown on the right-hand side here, are that there will be two columns. This first column here is information that you need to know. Many of the answers of the multiple choice questions will come from this column, and although the exact wording will not be used, it is expected that these ideas will be the ideas that all students, the concepts that all students should know. For example, if you look at Part A, philological approaches, you're expected to know what that would be, something we'll talk about later. This second column here are the illustrative examples. And you do not need to know all of the people or places or events or developments that are listed in this right-hand column, but rather one or two that you would know in depth to help you with the content in the exam. This will be most useful for your free response, whether it's the short answer questions, the DBQ, or the long essay questions. For example, you're not required to know about Petrarch, Valla, Ficino, and Della Mirandola. However, my advice is to choose two of these people. This review will go over the people that I have chosen, or the people that I believe will be both the easiest and give you the most information that will be relevant to help you succeed on this exam. So we're going to organize this study based upon the four periods in European history. And the first period is based from the years 1450 through 1648, roughly the period of the Renaissance through the end of the 30 Years' War. The course exam description is divided also into key concepts, and the focus of today's PowerPoint is Key Concept 1.1. The worldview of European intellectuals shifted from one based on ecclesiastical and classical authority to one based primarily on inquiry and observation of the natural world. One piece of advice to you as we're going through these reviews, if there's a word that you see that's in the key concepts, once again, I want to reinforce the fact that you're expected to know these. So if there's a word that you do not know, please look it up and learn it before the exam. For example, many students are unaware of what ecclesiastical means. So if that's something that you're not sure of, once again, please look it up. Make sure you are aware of it when you go into the test. As we begin our review of Key Concept 1.1, be aware of the fact that the Renaissance began and developed in the Italian peninsula, beginning in the late 14th century and being developed throughout the 15th century as well. Scholars of the period were known as humanists, and this new scholarly method is going to replace what was known as scholasticism. The College Board does not require you to know what scholasticism was for the AP exam. However, I would be familiar with it as you're preparing for the exam, in that you're able to use it as a way to contrast what Italian humanism is. Scholasticism was the intellectual trend of the High Middle Ages and was focused on reconciling faith and reason. Italian humanism, however, is going to differ than that. Italian humanists are going to study the classics, the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans. With that said, there was going to be more of a focus on individualism and a focus on secularism. Humanists were not necessarily anti-church or anti-religion. They just chose to study works that were not necessarily religious. Philology will be a method used by humanists to study, and philology itself, to put it simply, is a study of words and the use of words, a concept that we will discuss later on. And finally, because of the invention of the printing press, educational changes during the Renaissance will be highlighted as well. Increased literacy rates will grow, and although most of Europe will still be illiterate, literacy rates were higher than ever before in European history, especially in urban areas. Also, do keep in mind that the Italian peninsula was more urbanized than the rest of Europe. Most of Europe had about 10% of its citizens living in cities, whereas the Italian peninsula had about 25%. As stated earlier, the information in the left-hand column, except for scholasticism, is information that the College Board requires you to know for the exam. So make it a point to go over and understand these terms. The two examples, however, that I'm going to focus on to support these terms will be that of Petrarch and Lorenzo Valla. Petrarch, often known as the father of humanism, was one of the first to study the works of the ancient Romans. I believe he studied some of the letters of Cicero, and he was also one of the first to really distinguish this period they were living in as a new period, something unlike the High Middle Ages. The term Renaissance wasn't actually used until later on in history. However, the fact that the scholars of the period knew that something different was happening, something exciting and something new. Petrarch is also known as the inventor of the sonnet, and his most famous sonnets are about a woman named Laura who died during the plague. He used to model the ancient Romans and Greeks and led this revival in the Italian peninsula, also contributing to the use of vernacular in his writings. Lorenzo Valla is an excellent example of what philologists studied. Lorenzo Valla is best known for proving the donation of Constantine to be false. So, quick little lesson on the donation of Constantine. This was a document that the church had used to say that the Emperor Constantine back in the 4th century had given the church authority over parts of the Italian peninsula. Lorenzo Valla, by studying words, proved this document was false and not at all written by Constantine. Words such as fief and serf did not exist in the 4th century, and Valla was able to prove this not to be true. Once again, Valla himself was not anti-religious, but focused on using words and studying these ideas to further his own knowledge and further the knowledge of Italian society. Another concept developed during this time by humanists was the study of civic humanism. Civic humanism was a new political ideal that developed in the Renaissance city-states, notably Florence, that focused on both social and political implications based upon these ancient ideas of the Greek and Greco-Roman period. Most notably, it led to a secular political and individual behavior, best evidenced in the prince. Furthermore, these ideas spread throughout the continent because of Gutenberg's printing press. And not only will it lead to the spread of these new political ideas that will lead to the creation of the new monarchies, but will also lead to the growth of the vernacular, or everyday language, and works written in the everyday language, the development of national cultures, which will be behind the ideas of the new monarchies, a topic which we will discuss in a later PowerPoint, and the spread of the Renaissance to the north, what we call the Northern Renaissance, also a topic that we will discuss in a later PowerPoint. The examples I would like to focus on for this period include Baldassare Castiglione and Niccolò Machiavelli. Castiglione's most famous work, The Book of the Courtier, is generally defined as a book of courtesy, the way that leaders in society should behave. It was actually a fictional work that gave different examples of the proper characteristics of a courtesan, and the last chapter is actually dedicated to the way a proper lady should behave. And although this was aimed at the upper classes and the elites, it set an example of what was expected in society by the upper classes. A more realistic work that defines the politics of the period will be that of The Prince, written by Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was also a Florentine, and at one point he was exiled from Florence for going against the Medici family in one of the political feuds. While in exile, he wrote The Prince, and his model prince was Cesare Borgia. His model prince would be someone who is ruthless and amoral and essentially someone who removed morality from politics. The phrase "the ends justify the means" is often associated with the prince, and the fact that a ruler had to do whatever that ruler had to do to retain power and to keep a firm grip on his people. Borgia at one point conquered central Italy and removed many of the petty tyrants who had ruled some of the Italian city-states. And although Borgia's rule was welcomed by many of the citizens, the people that were removed from power and anyone who betrayed Borgia were ruthlessly dealt with, qualities that Machiavelli felt would make a more effective ruler. And although Machiavelli himself was not amoral, he was trying to show the conditions of what a good ruler would need to do in order to rule effectively. Many believe that his book was aimed at the Medici family in the hope that one day they would unite the Italian peninsula, something that did not happen during his lifetime, and actually did not happen until 1861, and certainly not by the Medici family. Moving on to our next topic, how did humanism affect the visual arts? And our key concept states that the visual arts were based on ideas of the Renaissance, promoted personal, political, and religious goals. And we're going to talk about each of these bullet points individually and show some examples of how they were. So the first bullet point that I would like to discuss is that of princes and popes. Princes and popes often commissioned works based on classical styles and employed geometric perspectives. One classical style brought back during the Italian Renaissance was freestanding statues, such as the David on the right-hand side, designed by Michelangelo. In addition, the creation of Adam, part of the Sistine Chapel, also painted by Michelangelo, is shown on the left-hand side, which shows an example of that geometric perspective. Finally, the idea of commissioning works, whether it be princes, popes, kings, nobles, and even cities. Renaissance art and architecture were big business, and money was needed to pay these artists and architects in order to do these. Once again, Michelangelo was paid to design the Sistine Chapel, which shows the creation of Adam, and Brunelleschi designed this dome for the Cathedral of Florence, which was one of the highlights of the city and is still a part of the city landscape today. One last idea I'd like to show as well with these works, the idea of the influence of humanism. Although both the creation of Adam and David are religious works, the emphasis isn't necessarily on religious, but rather on the individual, on the body, on the perfectibility of mankind as displayed in these paintings. Displayed in these artworks. Two other paintings that highlight this trend are The School of Athens by Raphael and The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. The School of Athens, on the upper left-hand corner, focuses on the Greek thinkers of antiquity. Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato are included, among others. The Birth of Venus shows the importance of Roman mythology to the Renaissance thinkers of the time period. More importantly, both of these paintings reflect a change, and they really reflect this change towards individualism. In all these paintings, the figures are shown, and they're very different from one another, and there's great effort put in to distinguish each of the characters from each other, which is something that is different than prior art periods in history. Of course, a discussion of Renaissance art and the Renaissance as a whole wouldn't be complete without a discussion and a good review of Leonardo da Vinci. Often dubbed the Renaissance man, da Vinci dabbled in pretty much everything. This slide reflects some of his greatest works as a painter, The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. And these works themselves once again show this focus on this individualism that Renaissance humanists studied. Furthermore, this also shows Da Vinci as a scientist. Um, in the middle is Vitruvian Man, and Da Vinci had probably the best anatomical studies of anyone up to that time period, further expanding on the knowledge of the ancient Greeks. Not shown in this slide, Da Vinci was also a botanist. He studied plants, and he was also an inventor. In addition, Leonardo was also an inventor. He understood that the use of compound springs could make a catapult stronger, and he dabbled with several other inventions of this time period, having sketches for flying machines, submarines, and bridges. Overall, it was this idea that Da Vinci just was curious, which kind of models this idea of what a Renaissance humanist and what a Renaissance thinker and artist all should be during this time period. One last thing before we go on. Do keep in mind, for purposes of the exam, humanists are those that studied during this time period. They were the intellectuals, whereas artists were not. So someone like Michelangelo would not be considered a humanist, but clearly in the examples we've talked about, humanism influenced Michelangelo's art. The Northern Renaissance, a topic which we'll talk about later, was more influenced by human-centered naturalism and portraiture. Portraits were also emphasized during the Italian Renaissance, but during the Northern Renaissance, we'll see some of these ideas and increase. For example, the Northern Renaissance, one of the earlier works, the Ghent Altarpiece, focuses on this idea of religion. However, later on, as much of the North becomes Protestant, the works begin to focus more on everyday life, as evidenced by Peter Bruegel's Peasant Wedding. Jacob Fugger, one of the leading German bankers during his time period, was painted by Albert van Dürer. And once again, this focus on this humanism, this individualism, the importance of the individual, we'll see a continuation of the growth of portraits. And most museums that you walk through today will display prominent portraits of people during this time period. Renaissance art and architecture also influenced subsequent art and architecture movements known as Mannerism and Baroque. These movements use distortion, drama, and illusion to support their points. And one of the most important painters that displays mannerism would be that of El Greco, or the Greek. A painter in Spain, one of his most famous works is the Holy Trinity. And if you look closely at this work, Christ's suffering is magnified by the distortion that the artist El Greco uses in his painting. As far as Baroque, we'll talk a little bit about Baroque paintings at a later date, but for Baroque architecture, one of the best examples that came about during the 16th century was the colonnade at St. Peter's in Vatican City. Baroque architecture was used to show the importance of the church or of a king, and to show the awe that should be experienced when going to these places. And Baroque was commonly used throughout St. Peter's Cathedral as well as it was built. Baroque was also used later on during the Counter-Reformation in an effort to show the awe of the church. And one of the later famous examples of Baroque mixed with Rococo architecture will be the Palace of Versailles, meant to display the power of France and the power of Louis XIV and show the awe within that as well. Humanism also influenced other thinkers to study science and reevaluate scientific methods. And many of the ideas of the Renaissance will be reflected in the scientific revolution. While most textbooks teach the scientific revolution in chapters that are after the Renaissance, the scientific revolution did indeed begin during the Renaissance and occurred simultaneously. The scientific revolution was based upon observation and experimentation and the ideas of mathematics which will be used, and these ideas often challenged antiquity as well as the church. For example, the concept of heliocentrism. For centuries, the church had taught the idea of geocentrism. the fact that the Earth was the center of the universe. However, by the end of the 15th century and throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, scientists developed the heliocentric theory, which was based more upon mathematics and observation. Heliocentrism, the idea that everything revolves around the sun and the solar system, was first espoused by Copernicus, and although his ideas were not published until after his death, these ideas were revolutionary for the time period. Later on, Johann Kepler expanded upon Copernicus' ideas by stating that the planets revolved around the sun in elliptical motions, and Galileo confirmed Copernican theory by the use of the telescope. Finally, in many ways, Newton perfected this idea of heliocentrism through his theory of gravity. And Newton is someone that I would advise you to study in detail. Newton is very prominently featured throughout the European history course, and some of his ideas, such as planetary laws of motion, are important to show this development of this new science during this period. And Newton really became this model that was looked up to, not only during his lifetime, but after his lifetime by some of the enlightened thinkers of the time period. In addition, the anatomical and medical discoveries of Vesalius and Harvey challenged the theories espoused by Galen and overturned these ideas that had been based about disease during this time period. Vesalius is known for his anatomical discoveries, even going further than Da Vinci had with his details of the human body. And William Harvey is known for the ideas of circulation involving the heart. Finally, the ideas of Bacon and Descartes contributed to the development of the scientific method. Bacon's inductive reasoning, combined with Descartes' deductive reasoning, and later combined by Newton, resulted in the development of the scientific method that is often used even today. Finally, keep in mind that the concepts of alchemy and astrology still appealed to elites and natural philosophers, and these ideas would continue, whereas the lower classes and the church still believed in traditional views, basically divine and demonic forces that would control. And, this is reflected in the continuation of the witch hunts, the, ideas that, famines were brought about because of bad behavior or because of temptation, and so forth. But overall, the scientific revolution was just this advance that is going to continue to influence. Later on, the scientific revolution is going to, these ideas based upon reason and study and observation are going to be applied into the Enlightenment and will be applied to human behavior and political ideals as well. This is the end of our first review. Key concept 1-2 is next.